The loss of the house was terrible, but fortunately we did, I did my best in the legal effort, but we're very short of funds and we didn't hire a lawyer. I think that's another whole story, the legal battle, but it was very illegal. It was in a historic district, but we had some money, and we also got a community rate, and Rick did great work, put in an awful lot of hours on this. So I think this is important. Some people say, well, the house is gone. I think that house is an important part of Gloucester's history. I wish it was more our living history, but I think there are lessons to learn here, how it happened, and make sure it doesn't happen anymore. The Globe just had a story a few weeks ago how just, I think, half a dozen important houses on the North Shore have been lost in the last few months as building has picked up. So I think this is the story of the house is important for history, and to make sure that this doesn't happen again, or as I've said, let's not have what happened of people making history. And also I think it's important. I've always felt truth is important, and a whole campaign of disinformation is going on. They're going to dedicate that parking lot and show how important it was, and keep still saying the house wasn't worth preserving. So I think it's important that the truth the truth being known now. So I think we'll let Rick take over from here and give the history.
Okay, thank you, Steve. It's great to be here in Gloucester with all its historic sites, and lament the loss of one of the more picturesque and had reached, of course, had a few vicissitudes of the times, and an untimely death in our opinion. Some people did make a great effort, as Steve said, to try to preserve the house. I was brought into the story a little bit late to get into the house, so although Steve I will credit with the life and death of a great American house, the Pierce Haskell Caliph House, 1795 to 2011, he created the title. And I'll tell you that this slideshow, though, is a little more than the house itself. It's more about the context in which it was built and the history of the timber frame that was in it, as well as the style of the architecture, the federal period that it was, and some of the examples of how you might better rescue a house like this and how you can make timber frame buildings last a very long time with care and TLC. So with that, I will start in this long story, and I'll try to make it as brief as possible because there are quite a few slides. What I'd like to tell you, though, is that the history of timber framing, and I'm not going to give you the entire history, but the buildings that have survived the longest have been well taken care of. The building you see on the right is a stave church in Norway that, believe it or not, dates to the 12th century. So that these buildings can survive just almost forever. The exterior cladding very often isn't the original, but the interior framing, believe it or not, is still in there. And these things were preserved with pine tar and things like that. So there was a great risk of fire, but if they didn't burn down, there was a good chance that the wood would last. And they did. And now we'll go on to another building, almost the same date. Actually, it's from the 13th to the 15th century in Pembridge, England. This is another stave church tower that actually is very reminiscent of those Viking buildings. So you can see how long these buildings will last. Another one is a market hall in Pembridge, England. This one dates to 1520. And if you don't believe it, even with the open sides, the wood has lasted since 1520. They dated this thing by dendrochronology. So that there's really not an excuse for saying, oh, the wood is too old and rotten, it's not going to last, you can't fix it. Usually there's a way, and this building has recently undergone some repairs, and you can see on the right-hand column there where they carefully pieced in some of the repairs. Now we get to America, and we have the 17th century buildings built in the same form as the British ones, with the half-timbered framing and the corner braces and things. This is the type of framing that was under the skin of the Pierce Haskell Califf House. And it's opportune that in the 19-teens or 20s, when the Brown House in Watertown was restored, before they put the clapboards on, they actually exposed all of that frame so you could see what it would have looked like as a half-timbered structure. It's brick fill between the studs. And then we have the Whipple House here in Ipswich, or down there in Ipswich, but very typical of that early period, with the steep roof and the heavy timber frame and these cross summer beams inside. This is evolving toward the Pierce Haskell Hallett House. And I just want you to know that Steve did want us to point out the fact that there are historic timber frames that are worth preserving, even when the skin has changed on the building. A lot of these buildings have been heavily restored. Here's the Brown House. This one is another Brown House that's actually in Hamilton. It's circa 1670, but you can see it got updated with its windows in the 18th century with a small pane windows. The diamond panes have been replaced. But there's an evolution to these houses and buildings. They don't just stay static. Here we have the old ship meeting house in Hingham. And what's remarkable about this is that it's the oldest meeting house in the country, 1681, but with its hipped roof. It's of the same type of roof framing almost, in a way, as the Pierce Haskell House, which had a hipped roof. So I'm kind of showing you the evolution of these hipped roofs on buildings. Now, this building has also been drastically altered. In the mid-1750s, they added flanking wings, and you can see the steeper roof of the original in the middle. So that building has been drastically altered from its 1680s appearance. Here's the old roof framing up in the attic of the building before it was restored. It's now all been opened up. But you can see how this framing is quite impressive. Then we get into the Federal period, and I wanted to show you the drawing on the left, which is remarkable. It's not so much that it's like the Pierce Haskell House, but it's the beginning of the Federal period, really, in this sort of Georgian Palladian style building. But it was done by John Trumbull in 1777 in Boston, if you can believe that. He drew that, and it probably stood down near Colonel Dawes' house in Purchase Street if it was built at all, but very similar to Colonel Thomas Dawes' designs. On the right is the first courthouse, or the first courthouse by McIntyre of 1785 in Salem. And that's very early Federal period. It's gone. It stood where on Washington Street in the middle where the railroad went through in the 1830s. But they all had these hipped roofs and very prominent in the Federal period. Federal Hall, of course, in New York, where Washington was sworn in, is the reason for the Federal style, really, they called it at the time. And you got into the neoclassical details, and here's the Hartford State House, similarly inspired by those. And then finally the Capitol, which Steve insisted I include, but this is the Latrobe Capitol, which actually is the Federal period version of our U.S. Capitol before it reached, had its 1860s cast iron dome put on. And that's the building Bulfinch left to us in about the 1820 period. And then he came north and he designed things like the Newburyport Courthouse. Well, people don't realize that's the same building that's there today. And the building on the right is my restoration based on Bulfinch's drawings, which are inside the entryway there. If you go see the building on the left, that's what they did to it in the 1850s. And nobody said it was an eyesore and it should be torn down. So these buildings evolve, and sometimes uncomfortably. I think that's one of Bulfinch's best buildings. So this is to demonstrate that buildings change and they don't always have to be the way they originally were, although sometimes it would be better. Now here we have again over at Andover, this is, I believe they call it either Bulfinch Hall or Pearson Hall, but it's one of those buildings that Asher Benjamin and Bulfinch both designed around New England all over the place. And then finally we get to one of the grand Georgian statements in Boston, the Shirley Eustace House, with a Federal period carriage house that came from Brookline down below, was built in 1806 with its hipped roof. About the same time they were building the Pierce Haskell Califf House up here in Gloucester. They were actually renovating that house probably. They were adding this coach house to the Gardner estate in Brookline. And it's been brought to the Shirley Eustace House so that we can see how you can transform a building even though it's been moved and restore it. There's the picture on the right of the house of the carriage house in the 1890s. That's probably Isabella Stewart Gardner at her summer house in Brookline. And then we took it all apart. It was donated by the people who wanted to build a McMansion on the site. And we got the frame of it, took it completely apart, and rebuilt it in Roxbury next to the governor's mansion. It's a perfect replica almost of the original coach house that was at Shirley Place. But you can see that the timber framing in these things is sound and can be reused even if you have to move it. So very often you have to replace a lot of it, but at some cost it's possible. And this is about possibilities. Here we have the Loring Greenough House in Jamaica Plain in 1815. And here it is again in the present day on the left, newly restored. But with its carriage house on the right there with all the little arches that was added in 1811. And that's another federal period addition with its hipped roof and a subsidiary building, that many of which have disappeared. There again you see that great timber framing of a timber frame structure of the period with the date 1811 on it, conveniently. But this is what was up in the attic of the Pierce Haskell house, and I never got to photograph it, unfortunately. But it was quite a substantial timber frame. And what we've got on the right is what happened over the period of the 18th century with some of these 18th century houses. This one is the Apthorpe House in Cambridge. They grew a third story. This one grew a third story in 1771. So even before the Revolution, these buildings expanded. And you have examples of that up here. Now, I don't know if any of you recognize that building, but it happens to be the home of Nathaniel Tracy in Newburyport. It's now the Newburyport Public Library. And it's the Sun Hotel at that time. It actually had been adapted as a hotel, but it had its carriage house, the same type of carriage house. Here it is again in the 19th century with its change to a library in the 20th century, but it's still intact inside. Some of the rooms are intact, same as the Saunders house up here. But then we have the designers of these places. And here we have a house by Samuel McIntyre on the right, and on the left is the Joshua Ward house in Salem. Very much like that three-story federal house up in Newburyport that belonged to Tracy. And you'll see that you can transform those. This is the Ward house years before it was restored. So it had been drastically altered. Again, we get to the sea captains' houses of the period of the federal period. This is the Hurd house in Ipswich, probably well known to you, but very similar to the houses built here in Gloucester. And you'll see that a lot of these are very well documented, and surprisingly enough, they were done probably by the architect of the church here in Gloucester, but also possibly the Pierce Haskell house. And here you have some of those interiors. You've got those upstairs. Here we've got the Sergeant Murray Gilman house, 1760s. Again, a great Georgian period house with a gambrel, a hip on a hip, which is basically a gambrel with four sides. But that's a great example of the type of the house that the Sawyer Free Library was originally. It had just a hip, gambrel hip, and then it grew again with a monitor, and I understand it even had a 22-foot octagonal turret on top, a room for an observatory. But then finally it gained its Victorian period look, and that's this building on the right, which is in, of course, Prudence Fish's book. But the last time I was here, I saw the house under construction or restoration. But it shows you the potential of restoration without giving up, and the transformations over time. Then we get to Jacob Smith, who was the great architect in Gloucester, who actually did the church in Manchester on the left. And you can see it's a near carbon copy of Asher Benjamin's design on the right from his Country Builder's Assistant of 1797. So you see where these designs came from. Here's the church, the Unitarian Church in Gloucester, 1806. Jacob Smith did this, but it's nearly a copy of the other one with some changes to the tower. But he built the houses along the street in the same manner with the same details, so that you can see what the Pierce Haskell house looked like probably originally when you know where they got the details. Here's Asher Benjamin's country builder's assistant, and you look at the doorway to the meeting house, and there it is. So you've got these details that are easily reproduced. I've often said that you can find one molding left in a house and you can reconstruct the entire interior as long as you know which Asher Benjamin book it came from. But I mean, this is an interesting phenomenon that even the great local house rights used these books quite literally and copied them dramatically well. This is another great house here, the 5 Franklin Square, but it's not easily visible. I understand this was taken in prudence before another building was built in front of it. But this is an unusual 3-story half house. This is the type that the Pierce Haskell Caliph house was when it was originally built. And you'll see that it evolved over time. It had apparently the doorway was on the left side, so it was just the reverse of this one. But they added, Captain John Haskell actually enlarged, probably added the 3rd story even in the early 1800s. And then again, they later added the front little entry with its oriel window over it and bay window. And then finally we know that the Moose Lodge took it over and added the porches and the moose, which I would love to know where they went. At any rate, the important thing to notice in these pictures is the landscape too. You see behind it on the right is the garden with fruit trees in it, and the big elm. You can get the branches around it, and you can see the big elm in the one of the postcard in the Moose period when the house was actually lifted up and moved back from that corner, but it still was near its same location. The Shirley Eustace house was moved 60 feet in the 1860s, but it was 65 feet long, so it was still partly on its own original site. And the same might be said of the Haskell house. It's really not off its original site. It's been removed slightly. At any rate, as these buildings evolve, it gives you all kinds of opportunities for period restorations. Do you go to like the first period or the second period or even the 3rd period? This house went through a great transition, and we'll show you some of what's left. But the context of the house is what's really important. Here you see in the background on the right, the 3-story Federal period house that's more or less the same profile, same period, and there's the design source again, right out of Asher Benjamin. The chimneys are end chimneys rather than in the middle, but basically the proportions and the scale and the style, it's the Federal period 3-story